Hi guys, GoodGulf here with a new video on Mesh Terrain 2.0. Back in 2019 I created a tutorial on how to create a terrain out of mesh instead of the standard Unity terrain. This is one of the most popular videos on my channel. However, one of the tools used to create vegetation on such a mesh terrain, Vegetation Studio Pro, is not widely available anymore. However, for a few weeks now, we have a new solution in the asset store which allows us to recreate terrain from mesh. It's the Foliage renderer mesh module. I can almost hear you say, why is this so useful? Well, Unity terrain, apart from receiving little love from the Unity devs, has a big limitation. It only supports height maps. So, for each coordinate on the map, you can only have one height level. Features like overhanging cliffs are a no-go. Before I show you what mesh-based terrain has to offer, let me first demo a few options for you. In this first demo, I created a mesh terrain and edited it in Blender. As you can see, I added an overhanging cliff and a cave, which now both have trees and details added to it. This is a good example of what Unity terrain cannot do: multiple floors and ceilings at any given coordinate. Here you can see the cliff, which has both details and trees underneath it and on top of it. Even the steep faces have details on it. However, this is something you can easily tweak on your mesh detail provider, which I will show in a walkthrough later in this video. The cave is another example showing that you can bring vegetation into a hollow shape. Because my Blender skills have only marginally increased since the 2019 video, I limited myself to this simple mesh. In the second scene I show two more examples. The first example shows a round world, where the trees and details grow on a standard sphere. To make this work in your game, you would need to do more tweaks to your character controller, but at least this shows that you can use your imagination much more in mesh-based terrain. The example next to it shows two disk worlds which sit above each other. Again, fewer limitations with mesh. This theory section comes straight from my 2019 video. A Unity terrain uses a height map. This is a rectangular map where you can only get one height value for any given XY coordinate set. As a result, anything requiring more than one height value on a given coordinate needs to be created by adding meshes to your terrain or tinker with shaders. Examples are arches, overhanging cliffs and caves. Also, non-rectangular map shapes are not possible in Unity terrain. What do you need to make this all work? The minimum assets you need are Microsplat and its Mesh Terrain module, Foliage renderer and its Mesh module, the free FBX exporter package from the Unity repository, Blender or any other 3D editor. Blender is free and you can find many tutorials on YouTube. In addition to these packages, I used Microverse to create the original Unity terrain and to use its vegetation prefabs. Obviously, other tools like Gaia will work too. To dress up the scene and test it, I used some other assets like Invector and Ocean Crest. I linked the assets in the description of the video. Okay, let's start with the Unity terrain. I created this terrain using Microverse. I will not demo that in this video since it will only detract from the rest of the video. I assume you will be able to create a terrain before trying to work on a mesh-based terrain. I saved the terrain scene as a new scene with a new name so I can always revert it to the original Unity terrain. The first step is to convert the terrain to Microsplat. With Microverse, create a terrain that can be done with a push of a button. Next, we select the terrain and select Windows, Microsplat, Terrain to Mesh menu item. I subdivided the terrain in at least 4x4 subterrains. Smaller will result in better performance, however, this also depends on the design of your map. More hills, cliffs and valleys will allow you to more easily break the terrain in smaller subterrains, because line of sight will allow that. Once we have the terrain converted to mesh, we select one of the subterrains and export it using the FBX export package. Make sure you export using binary mode, since Blender does not support ASCII mode FBX imports. Now we switch over to Blender. After importing the mesh into Blender, I deleted the default objects and switch to edit mode. I enable proportional editing and move vertices out of or into the mesh to create the overhanging cliff and cave. You will need to subdivide the mesh at some places. In the description I also link to a very good tutorial which shows you how to do this already after completing, let's say, the second tutorial. Next, export the mesh back into an FBX file, rename it and import it into Unity. You can now simply drag the new copy into the slot of the original mesh and it will show up with the edits. Note, if you want to use a third or first person controller on the terrain, you probably need to add a mesh collider to the terrain now. Okay, so far so good. We have the edited mesh terrain in Unity and we want to add the vegetation now. First, drop an instance of each type of vegetation somewhere in the scene. You need to have these in the scene before you create the Foliage renderer. This is a limitation in the current version of the Foliage renderer mesh module, which I assume will be changed in the near future. Next, create the Foliage renderer. Create an empty object called Mesh Providers, reset its position and place the terrain underneath it. Add the tree mesh provider and add the tree prefabs. Refresh the indirect renderer and the trees should appear after a few seconds. You can tweak the settings for the trees and apply the usual Foliage renderer optimizations. Next, we'll do the same for the details. Add the detail mesh provider to the mesh provider object and hit the refresh on both the detail mesh provider and the indirect renderer. You may need to tinker a bit with the settings in the detail provider. I found it to be a bit less stable than the tree provider, however, Ellen from Dice Wrench Designs is working a lot on improving it, so by the time you see this video, the user experience will probably be much better. So basically, we now have created a similar setup as we did back in 2019 with Vegetation Studio Pro and Megasplat. Next up, I will show you how to create the sphere example from the start of the video. Note, Microsplat also has a module to add splat maps to meshes, to make these look like terrain too. Okay, that's it for today, and I hope you liked this video. If so, then please subscribe and give it a thumbs up.